Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the first Highland Wonders in our 2023-24 series. To give you just a quick background about Okanagan Highlands Alliance, we are a conservation nonprofit here in Tonasket, working primarily up in the Okanagan Highlands. And we really believe that we can build a community and a world that prioritizes and cares for nature. And then shows that through their actions. So we're so grateful to live in this place where we can gather together in all 4 seasons and learn about and appreciate and steward our ecosystems and habitats and species. And then we can build community not only with other humans but with non-humans as well. So thank you for coming tonight. We really appreciate having you all as part of our community. To introduce myself, my name is Jen Weddle, and I am one of the co-directors of OHA, along with Sarah Kleitman, who's coming up to join me. And I'm going to turn over the microphone to Sarah to make a few more introductions.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Community Center, for being here and being such a wonderful venue for us to gather in that community that Jen talked about. I'm Sarah Kleitman. I'm the co-director of Okanagan Highlands Alliance, and I'd like to introduce our board. Our board president, Hannah Kleitman. Our vice president, Rick Massey. Our treasurer, John McReynolds, who's here. Our secretary, Charlie Walker, who's here. And Tia Wold, Paul Jeleno, who's here. And Berta Villa, our newest board member, we're really excited to have her join our leadership team. And then one other really important person that some of you know is pretty important to me too is David Kleitman, our senior advisor, who still works very closely with us, particularly on the work having to do with the Buckhorn mine and the Clean Water Act lawsuit that we have going on with that.
Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for the night. He is a longtime friend of OHA. He has led field trips. He has done Highland Wonders in the past. He has done plant surveys up on the Lost Lake Preserve. He's a botanist and an educator and a really engaging person to talk to. So, Dana Visalli, do I have to come up? From the Met and he also has some items over here for sale. He is one of the writers and editor also of the Met Naturalist, which is a quarterly news, what do you call it? A news publication?
Sure.
Okay. A quarterly publication all about the natural history of our area. It's fascinating always. So.
I just love the evolutionary story of life on Earth to the degree that we have any understanding of it. We don't know for sure what's right and what's wrong, but all of the scientific evidence is that life is on an enormous journey on the planet, that there was no life, that we know the story of the beginning of the planet, the solar system, and the planets accreted. They were in orbit around the sun, and it was a lot of rocky debris in our orbit, and it accreted into the planet. This all seems to be true. There was no life on the planet.
So, we're talking about the plant kingdom, plants on Earth, and the variety and how they function, and it's transferable to any piece of topography, whether we're talking about the Met-How or the Okanagan Valley, Washington State, North America. This story is true all over the world. The story of the evolution of plants. There are some mild complications in here. They're not too bad, but towards the end I talk about the hydrogen atom, and the hydrogen atom has 2 electron shells. Oh, I'm always afraid when I say that people will glaze over. Because you can't see hydrogen atoms and you can't see electron shells. And it has these atoms are set up in such a way that they have a natural attraction to join with other atoms. And so and what that means in the long term is that the evolution of life on the planet looks like it was in the structure of the atoms. And we'll talk more about that, and you can feel free to disagree. But it just makes the whole story deeper and more interesting. Rather than just talking about a flower, we have some great mystery here of the evolution of life on planet Earth. So this is a flower. I actually don't know. I don't know if this flower is in the Okanagan Valley. Does anybody know if this is here? It's called steer's head, Dicentra uniflora. It's actually not uncommon. It's not common, nor is it uncommon in the Met-Hal, but it's small, it's a spring flower, and it's hard to find. But I put it in just because it's such a weird and striking flower. I mean, I had a sort of a cartoon, a joke in my spiel for a while that it had evolved to look like a cow to chase predators away, scare predators away. But that's not true. It evolved, but it did evolve for a reason. It had all of the shapes that it has have a rhyme and a reason for functionality, and flowers are all about reproduction. So this flower is successfully designed for reproduction, but it's a very complicated flower. It's not like a buttercup, which is round like a wheel and have 5 petals, and the stamens are right there available to the insect. Everything's hidden away here. You can't even see the reproductive structures. So it's probably more recently evolved, more complex design than early flowers. I think that's fair to say. There's a couple things about this flower. So it's hard to find. It grows under bitterbrush, but it only grows about 1 inch high, and it grows in the spring, and it dries up by the middle of May, and then you don't see it for the rest of the year. The leaves dry up, the flower dries up. So it's a little hard to find. Trying to think of the gory details about this flower. It's pollinated by bumblebees, and the top, not the horns themselves, but where the horns initiate. Oh, I have I'm not sure. There it is. This swelling here and here, these are the nectaries for this flower. That's where the nectar is produced. Well, here's a hole. So the bee can land on the snout, it can push its tongue up into this hole, into the nectary, and get the nectar. Meanwhile, the snout actually isn't connected. It has a dividing line. It splits open, and the anthers spring out and hit the bee in the belly and deliver the pollen to the hairs on the bumblebee, which are probably slightly jagged to hold the pollen. It's this intricate, you would never, this is true for every organism, has this intricacy that you would never, ever guess at. So then the seed has a little fine, hairy protuberance on it called an aril, A-R-I-L. That's edible for insects. Ants like it. So ants grab the seeds and take them to their nest. They take the seeds and take them underground. They cut off the aril and eat it. What have they done? They've planted the seed. They've taken it underground and planted it. So somehow, without any kind of a brain at all, this flower and all of the 300,000 species of flowers on the planet have evolved this functionality and interrelationship with other living organisms. Symbiotic relationships, most often with insects. Actually, not quite all 300,000 of them, because 10% of flowering plants are wind pollinated. And we'll talk more about that. So let's see here. Oh yes, I forgot, but so I just pulled up this Clodius parnassus butterfly. It's another level of relationship. The plant itself is actually poisonous to animal life. You can't eat it. Well, this Clodius parnassus caterpillar, the caterpillar of this butterfly, eats this plant, and sequesters the poisons in the body of the caterpillar and then in the body of the butterfly so that they're poisons, so predators don't eat them. So the butterfly has somehow evolved this capacity to use the poison in the plant to its own advantage. So there's all of this complexity in this simple little plant that grows an inch high under bitterbrush. It's just an astonishing phenomenon. And that is the nature of life on Earth, actually. So we're talking about plants. We're talking about the flora of the Okanagan watershed and the Methow watershed, which are very closely related, have very similar histories. So flora is just the plant life of any particular region. You can define the region so we know which region we're talking about. So here are just a little smattering of different plants, some of them somewhat unexpected, like the one on the top upper left is called, sorry, I don't have my buttons quite figured out here. Yes, I want that one. Well, that's an algae. It's a green algae. It's called a desmid. It's related to some other algae we're going to see in a moment. But it's photosynthetic, and some people consider it to be a plant, and some people don't. Whether green algae are plants or not plants is argued. We can, the middle picture up top we recognize as a rose, but we don't recognize this creature. This is a famous plant in botanical circles. It's called Welwitschia. It only grows in the desert in Namibia. And it puts out it's considered to be a potential precursor to insect pollination because it's actually, strange to say, it's a gymnosperm, which means it's closely related to conifers, to pines and spruces and firs. It's a gymnosperm. It doesn't look like a gymnosperm, but that's the way things go. So it must create a cone of some kind, but it secretes a little bit of fluid on the female part of the flower to attract pollen, wind pollen, but that fluid has a little bit of sweetness to it, and insects come to it and pick it up. So it's thought to be perhaps an initial form of encouraging insect pollination. This is Drosera. That's the genus, sundew. This is a carnivorous plant that eats insects. They get stuck on these hairs, and the plant excretes juices and digests the insect. So it probably doesn't grow in the Okanagan, and it probably doesn't grow I've never seen it in the Methow, but it grows nearby. I have seen it on the Pacific, near the Pacific Crest Trail, near the Methow, but over the crest down onto the west side. A couple other plants here. We recognize raspberries. I don't know what kind of tree that is. But this is a ginkgo. So ginkgo is considered to be the most ancient tree on the planet. It's a fossil tree, but it still exists. It has its own plant division. There's only one species in that plant division. It's like there are 300,000 plants in the division of flowering plants, angiosperms. 300,000. There's one ginkgo on the planet, and that's what it looks like. And then our much beloved willow catkins. Some of us are just really into willows. And that's a male catkin. That's going to be pollen there. And it'll either be delivered by the wind or it'll be delivered by insects. So, I'm not going to go through the rest, just the diversity of plant life. We do go through it a little bit as we go along. So, plants are in here somewhere. This is the whole tree of life, all the living organisms on the planet. And there is at the bottom something called Luca, which is different than David Lucas. Looking for my red. Just don't have these buttons figured out yet. I can't quite see them. I think, yeah. So down here it says Luca, last universal common ancestor. It looks like life appeared only once on the planet. If you can trace some of the chemical evidence and the fossil evidence, life appeared once. There is no scientist alive that understands how life arose. It's an enduring, stupendous mystery that nobody understands. The first life form would have to function and survive, and eat, and possibly reproduce would have to have a level of complexity that is incomprehensible to just spring into appearance from nothing. So science doesn't understand where Luca came from, but it can trace the relationships from there. It can trace the relationships of bacteria, early organisms, single-celled, a certain kind of cell called a prokaryote cell. We'll talk a little bit about that. All these up here are eukaryotes. So this is a major, major division in the evolution of life, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. You don't have to remember this, or maybe you already know it, but it's just that there is this journey. And when we make our way through the day, we never think about the fact that we are part of this enormous journey of life. So the prokaryotes, there's two, I guess we would call them divisions. There's bacteria and archaea. Well, archaea are bacteria-like. They're single-celled, they're this particular kind of cell, a prokaryotic cell, but they cannot live in an atmosphere with oxygen. Well, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere prior to the advent of photosynthesis. The atmosphere is currently 21% oxygen. It's all put there by plants. And we could not live 2 minutes without that oxygen that is a byproduct of photosynthesis. You know, science sometimes calls it a waste product. I think that's very inaccurate to call it a waste product. It's a system. It all works together. And you can't have plants without the animal kingdom, and you can't have the animal kingdom without plants. So then the eukaryotes, which are larger cells, sorry, I still don't have it yet. Okay, get that memorized. All these up here are, here's the word, eukaryote. These were prokaryotes, much smaller cells, prokaryotes. We'll talk about them. Our cells, animal cells, fungi, plants, they're all eukaryotes. Well, that shows a certain relationship at this point here, and even the single-celled organisms that things like paramecium, protists that we've heard of, amoebas, they are eukaryotes. Even though they're small, they are 100 times larger than bacterial cells. So life has evolved over time. I think there's a few, let's see. I just wanted to point out there that the algae and single-celled eukaryotes, it's not an important point, but they really should be together on this tree. So eukaryotes, prokaryotes, moving right along. Here's comparative images of that prokaryotic cell. Prokaryote means before the cell, or before the seed. Eukaryote means the true cell. So I can't tell you how fortunate we are that we got the true cells, and the bacteria got the fake cells. And I'm just making a joke that the way we use language, that we always think we have the real stuff, we have the real goods, and the other organisms got whatever was left over. Anyhow, the word prokaryote means before the cell, before the seed. So bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. There are some notable differences. They're much smaller, 100 times smaller, seriously invisible. I put down here, so 1 micrometer, 1/1,000,000th of a meter. I mean, that is less than a speck of dust by far. They have no nucleus. So they have DNA, but there's no nucleus to protect the DNA. There are no organelles like our mitochondria, which we've heard of. We can't quite remember what they are, but they are inside of almost all of our cells. Are many mitochondria, and they're bound by a membrane, like their own little world. In fact, they have their own DNA. I don't know if you remember that story, which I don't remember well, but you remember the term mitochondrial DNA. That DNA, the DNA in mitochondria is only passed on, how's that work? Through the female. Through the female. And so they traced the human lineage back to a single female 200,000 years ago. Anyhow, prokaryotic cells not only don't have any mitochondria, they don't have any organelles. So it's a very different kind of cell, but it's a living cell. It worked. It was the early life. We don't know how it happened. I'm just making the point that these very different kinds of cells exist. I think I'm going to, up in the corner there, is going to come up. That. So, how can these mitochondria have their own DNA? Well, that was addressed and largely answered. I think science fully agrees at this point by Lynn Margulis, a name you may or may not remember. She's famous for being Carl Sagan's wife. Everybody's heard of Carl Sagan, but really Lynn Margulis did probably better work than Carl Sagan did. But she didn't get as much credit. Nothing against Carl Sagan, he was a fine guy. Anyhow, she figured out that the reason that there were organelles inside of eukaryotic cells that had their own DNA is because they had been engulfed by a larger cell that was trying to have lunch, and it was never digested. They call it endosymbiosis, which means, symbiosis means life together. Endosymbiosis means life together inside of one living organism, inside of another. So here is a larger organism trying to engulf and consume a smaller organism, and instead they start to work together. And that, it's endosymbiosis, and that is the theory of where things like mitochondria came from. So here's the plant kingdom. So this is the plant kingdom in Okanagan County, and in the Methow, and on the west coast of Washington. It's true all over the world. So there are these divisions. These divisions, they have these big names, none of which are particularly familiar to most of us, but then there's names we have heard of. So, well, we know about green algae, we've heard that word. Liverworts, we've heard of them. Hornworts, haven't heard of them. There aren't very many hornworts. So this is a number on the planet. So green algae, certain number of species. Some are numerous, and look at ginkgo. How many ginkgos are there on the planet? One species. How many flowering plants? So that's what I had to update this with. So this down at the bottom here, they call flowering plants magnoliophyta. Well, the word phyta means plant. Plant, 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 plant. It's a ginkgo phyta. It's a ginkgo plant. It's a cycad plant. I have a cycad at home. There's only 160 on the planet. You can buy them. I got it from, it might have been Walmart. They mailed it to me. It was really fun. And it's lived for 4 years in my window. Really fun to have a cycad, but it's this ancient plant. Anyhow, phyta means plant. But I wanted to point out there, I haven't seen flowering plants called magnoliophyta that often. More often they're anthophyta, angiosperms, angiospermophyta. I just wanted to point out that this isn't all totally settled down. This taxonomy, phylogeny is not totally settled. And there should be one more. Oh, wrong way, sorry. So how many flowering plants are on the planet? I've already said, I said 300,000. This says 250,000. It's just not up to date. This is out of a botany book, but they go out of date every 10 years. So now the number is 300,000. So I wrote it in there. But this is the plant kingdom. How many of these are in our area? That's a question. Let's see here. I have this. So this is a chart I put together some time ago. So it does say, it says number of species in the Methow. I think this would be also transferable to the Okanagan. Very similar. We're not talking exact numbers. We're talking generalities here. You can see general relationships. Right away, what division of plants dominates the landscape? Well, you look through, look at that, 1,200 flowering plants. In the Methow, I would say very similar number in the Okanagan. So some of these names we're familiar with. I keep forgetting. Mosses. Okay, we know what mosses are. Club mosses. Some of us know what club mosses are. Horsetails. We all know horsetails. Ferns. So they have bigger names. Horsetails, Sphenophyta. Ferns, Pteridophyta. So phyta means plant. Ptera means feather. Pteridophyta means feather plant. So all these words can be translated and have, makes them easy to remember. So this is an evolutionary journey here. Look, the green algae appeared 1 billion years ago. Well, that's green algae. They're green. They're photosynthetic. Photosynthesis. I talk about it more towards the end. It's just the greatest metabolic innovation. That's what Lynn Margulis said in the history of the Earth. And why is that? We'll talk about it. Anyhow, the main point here really, to try and abbreviate this a little bit, is there's something happening here. There's some kind of direction to the evolution of the plant kingdom, and that I could have said life on Earth. It gets more complex over time, and to some degree it gets bigger. Remember, these things started out as prokaryotes. They're utterly invisible. So what is this? What are these X's? Well, many of these more ancient plants reproduce with a tailed male gamete, a tailed male sperm. I like to say that is a very primitive way to reproduce. Yeah, because it's sort of a joke, because that's how humans reproduce. But it faded out. No X's down here. And so what's the deal? Why was this selected against over time? Well, you need water. You need, for plants can't move around. They can't join together. The sperm had to swim out into the lake or the ocean and find the female. It's a tough way to reproduce. So better ways evolved, and one was pollen, to just cast the male DNA to the wind, but do it in the millions of pollen grains, which you may have seen that in the season when like ponderosa pines cast their pollen. It just looks like a fire. Anyhow, it was selected for as a functional, possibly better way to reproduce. That might be arguable. In any case, you see all the later organisms use pollen of plants in the plant kingdom, and there's no fledges. So there's just direction here. So this is really, what this really is the settling of dry land. You don't need water. You have a cuticle, that's a waxy coating on the surface of the leaf, so you don't lose water. You have to be able to retain water. How about a vascular system? How about some plumbing, so you can grow more than an inch tall? You don't just absorb water, but you can somehow move water uphill. Well, that started here with club mosses, horsetails, and now we have conifers. The tallest tree in the world is a redwood in California. It's 400 feet tall. How does that tree move water up 400 feet to the top of that plant? It's just phenomenal, phenomenological. But it does. It's actually through the electrical attraction of the atoms, like a magnet, because they're evaporating at the top of the tree and they pull the other ones up. But I didn't mean to go into that particularly. The point here is evolution has a certain direction of increasing complexity. You can find that kind of thing in many aspects of the evolutionary story. Circled a few things just to emphasize flowering plants, that they dominate in terms of numbers. Actually, they don't. I looked it up today, and so we know that we know that there's extensive conifer forests, and I looked it up today. Conifers cover about 25% of the Earth's land surface. Grasses are a flowering plant, but they're wind pollinated. They cover 30% of the land surface. So it's not all about insect pollination. Many things work. That fact keeps coming home to me when I look at the evolutionary and biological story, because we like things we think, no, it has to be done a certain way, it has to be done this way. And there are dozens, hundreds of different ways for organisms to succeed on the planet. I don't know why I still can't remember these buttons. It's too much fun. So there is a major split. So we're talking about flowering plants now, plants that have flowers. So that discludes conifers, ferns, mosses, club mosses. They don't flower. But flowering plants are the largest group of plants on the planet, the largest division, 300,000 species, each one of them different from every other one. There's one major split. Those plants, all of those 300,000 are either monocots or dicots. I swear to God, I cannot remember. Here. They're either monocots or dicots. What's the difference? Well, and I think I can pull up to make it a little easier here. So there are These are monocots. Well, we know what these are. We know what grass is, we know orchids, we know lilies. What can we think of that's similar about them? If we think of their leaves, they have veins that are parallel. And certainly with grass, we can think of that. The veins all run parallel, like railroad tracks. Whereas the veins in dicots are net veined. Net veined. Monocots, flowers are in threes or multiples of threes. That's probably, yeah, that's even true with grasses, even though we can't see the flowers are so small. Dicots, fours or fives, or multiples. Could be 8, could be 10. There's a difference in the way the seed forms, the seed cotyledon. They're just very different. It extends all the way back. People, the evolutionists, have not been able to figure out when this split occurred. It seems to be flowering plants evolving twice. Almost more like convergent evolution than having split at some time in the past. So not only was there a time on Earth when there were no plants, plants first appeared, these numbers are hard to remember, I think about 500 million years ago. The first land plants started to colonize land about 500 million years ago. Well, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That means there was 4 billion years with no life on land. So most of the history of Earth, there's been no life on land, if you stretch it out in that way. And the land surface would have been very different than it is now because plants hold it together. I don't know if you've noticed that. I live on the Methow River, and my house would fall right in the river if it weren't for the plants on the bank that hold the soil together. It would just wash away when that flood comes on June 1st every year. But the plants hold it all together. It's quite remarkable. Well, that's true all over the world. There would be no soil if it weren't for plants. Yeah, this is a picture I took 18,000 years ago during the last ice age in the Methow Valley, and this is, that's a joke, you don't have to take it seriously. This is Mount Gardner and Silver Star, and they were completely, it's not really Gardner and Silver Star, and I don't know if you know, we have mountains by that name in the Methow, but this is what it would have looked like. And that was only 18,000 years ago. And not only, so we have these ice ages. In terms of plants, it removed all the plants. All the plants were pushed down to Wenatchee because the ice didn't quite reach Wenatchee. And they all gathered together there. But then this didn't happen once, this happened 20 times in the last 2 million years. Ice advanced and retreated and advanced and retreated. The Earth is just so dynamic, and the plants have somehow adapted to that. They could not survive this. This ice was here for probably 5,000 years, and then receded and melted, and the plants had to recolonize the land they had lost. So it's an interesting enough subject that people write books about it, and this is a great little book, After the Ice Age. And she's got some drawings like this in there. This says maple, chestnut, white pine, hemlock. So this is how far south they were pushed during the last glacial advance. They were down here. Now all 4 of these species have recolonized New England, and they all exist in this shaded area. But that means that the maple and the chestnut had to travel 2,000 miles back north from Louisiana. And how do they do it? Well, they do it in various ways. Chestnuts, how do you think? The squirrel's going to carry them. The squirrel's going to carry them, 100 feet north and bury them in the ground, and it'll germinate, and the next year they'll carry another 100 feet. Maple has little wings on it that on a strong wind will blow. And so it's just something we don't think about, but is a fact of life, that plants have to move around according to varying physical circumstances on the planet. So we're going to look at one picture probably of each in that chart. So this is green algae. And so green algae is sometimes, when we were in school, green algae was not a plant. It is often now included in the plant kingdom, partly because it has the same kind of chlorophyll. It's obviously photosynthetic, which means it captures the energy of the sun in its cellular structure and has that energy available for life. So number of species worldwide, 400, but it's And it's interesting, it's still it's an early plant form, reproduces with that tailed or flagellated male DNA. But it's in water, it doesn't need a cuticle, it doesn't need a vascular system, it doesn't use pollen, it doesn't make seeds. I'm going to skip that. This A is trying to escape here. It's supposed to say chara. Chara is a very common type of green algae, which actually is often in its own division called charophyta. But sometimes it's in chlorophyta, which are the green algae. It is green. It looks like what we would call a land plant. It grows in water. It's in every still water body, every lake, probably in all of Okanagan County. It's very common, but it's considered to be a predecessor to land plants, the predecessor to land plants. And you can see it looks like which thing does it look like? I guess it looks like a horsetail.
Bill.
But this is also a charophyta, surprisingly, a single cell green charophyte or green algae. Anyhow, it's the beginning of plant evolution. These are aquatic organisms that over time change their structure through natural selection to be able to live at the edge of the water and then over time on dry land. This is another group, the liverworts. You've heard of them, liverworts. The word wort means plant, so that word means liver plant. Why is it called a liver plant? It's because of the tremendous myth-making quality of the human mind. And we talked about this a little bit at dinner. It's amazing how confused humanity can be. And I brought up the subject of identity because that's what these wars are about. You know, we're fighting because I believe I'm this and that person is something else. And I have a story that I can tell you that substantiates my identity. It's just such a powerful force for most of us to want an identity. Well, a lot of the identity that we embrace. These stories are not real stories. They're fake. They're myths. They never happened. So to go back to the plants and the myth-making power of the human mind. In the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, people were taking an interest in plants. They looked at these plants and they understood a little bit about the organs inside the human body, and even though early in that time it was illegal, it was considered sacrilegious to open up a human body and look inside. But they saw these lobes, and they thought it looked like the liver. And so they created a book in the 1300s, which comes up in the next slide, called the Book of Signatures, which is sign language from God, because God doesn't speak English. He didn't speak English, so he had to speak to humanity in sign language. And the idea was that God made plants to look like the organs that they would heal. And so walnuts, good for the brain, because it looks like a brain. Mushrooms, very good for hearing because it's just baloney. It's just complete baloney. But that's the way the human mind works. We don't care about accuracy. We just like to make up stories and then invest in them and march off to war. It's so bizarre. So I like this cartoon. This is the evolutionary journey here. I'm looking for trying to guess here. There. So, we started out as little furry creatures and we evolved into maybe Neanderthals. It's just a cartoon. It's not supposed to be accurate. And then Homo sapiens, and we finally made it to the pinnacle of evolution. And the thing is, we're not done. There's no way that we're done. There's so much more room to grow for humanity. And so that's what this cartoon says. I wondered when you would notice that there's more room. And we got to get these myths out of our mind, I think. So there's a division called hornworts, and they're good for your horns. There aren't very many. I think it says 160 species on the planet of hornworts. I've never seen one. I've never identified one. Has anybody ever seen a hornwort in here?
Hornwort?
I don't know if we, or worms. They're closely related. They had the same ancestor 4 billion years ago. Anyhow, there are these organisms called hornworts, and they're rare. I think our little chart says 160 species on the planet. I don't know much about them. I've never seen them, but they're on the chart, so I put them in. But mosses, okay, we got a lot of mosses. There's 12,000 species in the world. I think I have a list of about 150 in the Met How. There would certainly be 150 plus in Okanagan. They're beautiful to look at, magnified. And this particular one, so I actually, even though it doesn't look like a real picture, I took this underwater because this Poseidons is an aquatic moss that grows in the Met How River in fast-moving water, stuck to the rocks. It's quite an amazing environment for it to live. And there was this trout in the picture, just to prove that I was underwater. And then you look at this moss, and it's got this wonderful design to it, and that's true for many, many organisms. And then if you magnify the leaves, they have this little extra flappy thing on each leaf. So it's just this, at every level, there is this profound perfection of design in life, in the natural world. Even in rocks, actually, they also have a certain perfection. So there's 12,000 species of mosses, but if we had our little chart, we'd see they don't have vascular tissue. They can't conduct water. So the tallest moss on the planet is a foot tall. It can't get any hot, it just has to conduct water up. It can't move it up through. It has no plumbing. So plumbing evolved later. These are the asexual reproductive structures of a certain moss, actually a common moss in our area called juniper haircap moss, because the sporophytes wear little hats. Isn't that cute? They're ski caps to keep warm, and those come off actually. And the actual sporophyte is under that cap, and the sporophyte has another little cap that closes it up, and this is popped open. And then the sporophyte has these teeth that split apart, and then depending on the humidity, the teeth fold into the capsule and pick up spores, or if it dries out, they expand outward and extend the spores to the wind. So those teeth move in and out, and in and out, and spread the spores to the wind. And this is probably an actual kind of micro photograph of the tip of these sporophytes. So again, intricate design hidden from us unless we look more carefully. Moving on from, we had liverworts and hornworts and mosses. There's another division. So this was our bigger piece, and I cut it up here, but plant division, club mosses. There's 1,200 species worldwide, 8 in the Met How, probably 6, 7, 8 in the Okanagan. Some club mosses get 2 feet tall. This is at my home. This shows the quality of my soil. This is glacial. These are water-rounded rocks, and the river's not very far away, but it's down 20 feet. This was left by the glacier. When the glacier melted 14,000 years ago, these are all water-rounded cobbles. And now they're covered with life. This is lichen. But it does fascinate me. This rock you can't even see the rock. It's completely covered. I don't know how life can do that. So these are lichens, but this is club moss. It's Selaginella is the name. And actually club mosses have somehow come up with a cuticle, which means they can retain moisture when it's dry, and they have a vascular system, which is why there were club mosses that were 120 feet tall. Wow. Yeah. All the coal deposits are made out of club moss trees, lepidodendron, not necessarily just this one, but the coal deposits from 350 million years ago are made out of club moss trees, which no longer exist, and horsetail trees, which no longer exist. And I think the next picture has horsetails. So things change over time, and why do they no longer exist? I think that they don't create wood in the way that conifers create hard wood, and so conifers were able to overtop them. and push them back down into the lower strata of the terrestrial landscape. So why are they called club mosses? They have, the reproductive structures are often club-shaped. We do have this species in the county, Lycopodium. And this is a picture inside one of the little capsules that would be in this club, forming the spores, just to show the intricacy of hidden from our eyes that is still going on with living organisms. These are horsetails. They used to be 40 feet tall. And they're a common part of coal deposits, but they no longer exist. Tree ferns were 100 feet tall. They're still 30 feet tall. This is, of course, a living tree fern. They still exist, but they're no longer 100 feet tall. So things change over time. There's a lot of competition out there. And I would say they were outcompeted first by the conifers, which created these woody trunks and could grow up to 400 feet tall, and then even the flowering plants, which arguably took over the planet. Conifers, we don't often know or see, but conifers have male cones that create the pollen and female cones that need to receive the pollen. How's the pollen going to get to the female? It's wind pollinated, so it's hit and miss. So I would say they probably produce 100,000 pollen grains for every one that manages to get by chance to a female cone. It just blows around. And the next picture, this is at my house. It looks like there's a fire, but it's ponderosa pines casting pollen in June 6th, 2011. Yeah. Well, first time I saw this, I thought the forest was on fire. But that's just random casting of pollen that by chance will hit the female stigma on a cone. And this is in, I think, Clear Lake, or one of those big lakes in the south here. It's just all wasted pollen. It's just a very expensive, biologically expensive way to reproduce, and flowers were a somewhat better idea. Nonetheless, conifers still cover a third of the Earth's landmass. So many things work. These are flowering plants, so we don't think of maybe cottonwood. Sorry, did that wrong. Cottonwoods, these are male catkins, I'm pretty sure. They're going to cast pollen. There would be female catkins. These are male catkins on birch. These are male catkins on alder. There would be female catkins, smaller, where the pollination will take place and the seed will form. Well, these are flowering plants. But they still are wind pollinated. Most flowering plants are animal pollinated, but I think 10% of those 300,000, that's the number I've been saying, there's 300,000 flowering plants on the planet, 10% of them are still wind pollinated. Many things work. Don't have to abandon old ways. So, insects at some point moved onto land. Well, insects could not move onto land unless there was food. Where's the food going to come from? Plants create all the food. 99.9% of the food on the planet is created by photosynthesis. Photosynthesis had to be invented, plants had to move onto land. Once there were plants on land, insects could follow them. So the insects ate the plants, but they were there, and they started interacting with the plants, and over time, somehow, a symbiotic relationship arose where the insects were pollinating the plants. This is a willow catkin, male. There would be a female catkin as well. They're very pretty, especially Sitka can be red like that. Before they fully open, willows are 50% wind pollinated and 50% insect pollinated. When the willows bloom in the spring, they buzz with insect life. You can hear them buzzing. Why? Because insects, they produce a tiny amount of nectar. It's the first nectar because they bloom in April, and the insects go after it. They're starving for some food. So they collect both the pollen and the nectar, but they're also wind pollinated. So it's sort of a halfway compromise. That's the halfway point, speaking of halfway. Should we take a break? Well, back to work. I mean, for you, I actually meant that for you, because you have to. It's a bit of a brain strain to pay attention to all this stuff. But anyhow, it is our world, and our world has gone through these things. You know, it's not something I mean, even I've given this kind of presentation a number of times, and I never think about this when I go out walking, you know. I just wish we could be more aware of the magical, wondrous quality of all of the world around us. And maybe some of you are capable of doing it, but I keep forgetting. So I thought I'd put up just the generalized flower, just as a reminder. We remember that flowers have sepals, most of them. The thing is, as I've said several times, there's 300,000 species. They're all different, so they've all got a variation on this theme. But the general theme would be sepals, petals, stamen, where the male DNA, which is somehow this thing managed to create multiple microscopic grains of DNA. How does it do that? And then the female reproductive structure, so the unfertilized eggs are down here in the ovary, usually a swelling, often in the center, but not always, or sometimes the petals are up above the ovary, and sometimes, anyhow, they're just any variation. But the stigma at the top is for gathering pollen, and it's usually sticky. And if a pollen grain hits it, it'll stick to it. Well, what good does that do? Because the eggs are down here. Well, magically, the pollen grain grows a tube down through the style. It's called the style. And the DNA then moves down through the tube and fertilizes the egg. It's, don't try that at home. So I pulled up our early friend, the steer's head here, just to show how far flowers vary from the generalized theme here. And there would be many other examples of that. It's one of the more far out flowers around, that steer's head. But this is, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. This is a sepal. So that's what that became. These are petals. And the reproductive structures are inside the snout, as I said. But the snout splits open and delivers the pollen to the bee, as per plan. So just two generalized shapes for flowers. And the point here is you can become an interpreter of the evolutionary journey of plants by realizing that this type of variability, and you don't have to interpret it to anybody else. You can walk around and understand that some plants are radial, round like a wheel for a reason. Other plants are bilateral, like this calypso orchid, and there are reasons for it. You can imagine that this would be easy, very easy to get to the reproductive structures, very easy to get to the pollen. Oh, these are all anthers. There'd be some female pistils in the middle. They're probably blocked out by the blue ink, but these are all male anthers. But look how easy. It's a landing pad. It's like a helicopter landing pad. Any insect can land there. Whereas on that calypso orchid, you can't really even see the reproductive structures. And so these are different strategies for reproduction. And in fact, a calypso orchid, I have read, and I'm fairly sure it's true, it's called a deception pollinator. It puts out a fragrance that attracts bees, but it gives no nectar. And it really, in a sense, it gives no pollen, because orchids deliver pollen in a glob, literally, a glob, one glob, called a pollinia, and strangely, that pollinia gets glued to the head of the insect. I don't think I thought to put a picture in, but you can get pictures online. Insect with pollinia in Google, and you'll get these pictures with an insect with a big glob of pollen stuck on its head. And then they're not very bright, so they go to another flower and they deliver that pollen to the female reproductive structure. And the female somehow is able to extract it from the bee. That's how many orchids work. So here's some variations on flower shapes. They all have a rhyme and a reason. I think I circled some of the nectaries. So buttercup, if you pull the petal off a buttercup, you can see the nectary with your bare eye, and it's kind of fun to see, and children like it. There would be a little bit of sugar in there on each petal. So the bee, then you start to figure out, well, the bee sticks its head down in here to get the nectar, and the tongue down in there, and here's the anthers, and they hit the bee on the head and they deliver the pollen, which is what the flower wants to do. So it gets the bee to act the way it wants it to act. Columbine, we're familiar with columbine. Well, the nectar is way back here. Here's one of the, I think that's a petal. It's probably a sepal and a petal, I'm not sure. But obviously evolved to serve a particular function. And the nectar is back here, so it's back here almost an inch. Well, you can almost picture what the possibilities are for what animal can reach nectar that's back an inch. Obviously, hummingbirds are good pollinators for columbine, and there would be some moths with proboscises long enough to reach in there. But hummingbirds, I mean, I have red columbine and I've seen hummingbirds at them regularly. I actually couldn't remember what flower this is. I looked through my 2 pollination books and I couldn't find the picture where I got this. Because it's like an anemone, but it has these pollination tubes. There's one there and there's one there. I don't know what that is. This is monkshood. We'll see more, I think we see more pictures of monkshood. Maybe we don't. Maybe it was last night. But anyhow, this is the hood. This is the hood. That's why it's called monk's hood. The reproductive structures are down here. These are the anthers, and then the female would be in the middle of that bunch of anthers. This is the nectary taken out of the flower. This is, you can barely see an outline of the nectary inside the hood. So the only way to get at that nectary, well, actually there's 2 ways to get at that nectary. The main way is to shove your way in through these 2 petals, push them apart, and into the hood, and stick your tongue up and get that nectar. Meanwhile, your belly is getting completely covered with pollen from these anthers. Then you do it again, and you deliver the pollen to the female stigma, which would be sticking up right here. The other way, and I have a drawing of this, I don't think I put it in this show, you just bite a hole. You just bite a hole in the hood. And they'll do that. They figure that out, and actually with age. The young ones don't know how to do it, and the older ones do. So there's some advantage to getting older. And so the bees have co-evolved with the flowers, and they have evolved different shapes of tongues to access different kinds of flowers, and they're on different insects, of course. But so flies are not very good pollinators, and they doesn't look small, but it is small. You can imagine it. I don't know. It's probably a millimeter. Very small fraction of an inch. And flies are pollinators, and they'll pollinate certain flowers that where it's easy. There's landing pad flowers that open wide up, and you can land right on it, and the nectar's not very far away, and you can get at it. These bees, this is the tongue of a bee. They're extrudable. They can stick them way out there, and then butterflies and moths have these. What is it, proboscis? They can curl it up, but they can uncurl that. And actually, I don't know if it's in here. I think it is. Yes, I like this little bee. This is a megachilid bee, and it brings up the fact that it's another world. There's probably 1,000 species of bees in Okanagan County, and we barely, so it's a few people who know what they are, but most of us don't, and we don't see them, we don't recognize them, and it was not that we should, but we could. It's just that there's all this variety, and it's always beautiful, and it's always interesting. So I was fascinated by this little megachilid bee, because most bees store the pollen on their legs. Megachilid bee stores it on its butt. That's pollen right there, for whatever reason. This is a shooting star. I remember taking this picture up on top of, sorry, I forget the name of the, sort of a low peak in the Met Hal, but there was a big clump of them there. Anyhow, beautiful flower. In the last 5 or 6 years, or 7 years, a lot of the scientific names of plants have changed. I think they say 25%, something like that, of the scientific names of flowering plants in the Pacific Northwest changed. So this one changed, and I put them in here in this way. This was the old name, Yoticatheon, and this is the new name, Primula. So for me, there's often a sense of loss. For one thing, it's harder for me now to memorize a new name, but Dodecatheon, I've always loved that name because it means 12 gods. And it relates to that mountain of the gods in Greece. And the gods just love this flower, and all 12 of them, so they called it Dodecatheon. I just like that name. So primula, I looked it up, it means first. And it refers to they use that name because this flower blooms in the spring. So it's a first flower to bloom. These things aren't exact, that's just where they come up, the way they come up with these names. The point here actually is, look at the weird shape of this flower. The petals are swept backwards, like a shooting star, which is why it has that name. The anthers point forwards, and they're fused together. Shooting stars are buzz-pollinated. The pollen won't come out of the stamens. There's only a tiny little hole, like a salt shaker, and they won't come out until they're vibrated at middle C. It is around middle C, that's what they say. You can get a tuning fork, middle C tuning fork, and put it on those stamens and the pollen will fly out. But the bee vibrates its wing muscles at that vibration level, and the pollen flies out and sticks all over the hairs on its abdomen. Buzz pollinated. That's why it has that shape. This is a fantastic little flower that grows up at Hoodoo Pass in the Methow in the Sawtooth Range. And other than that, it's a disjunct, which means there's no more of it around until you get to Idaho. So somehow it jumped over the eastern half of Washington and got to Hoodoo Pass. The blue one is the forget-me-not, fairly obviously, and this is called Snow Diglossia here, which is equally beautiful. And you have to get there at the right time, like June 5th. Maybe June 5th to June 10th. Changes from year to year. Anyhow, an interesting thing about the forget-me-not is it has a yellow throat. See that yellow? Once it's pollinated, it turns red. And there are some insects don't see red very well, so it's like a stop sign. It's like, don't waste your energy on me, I've already been pollinated. So they have these little tricks that you would never guess at. And this, by the way, oh yeah, I think I have here, I think I have a picture of how you're supposed to observe this plant, yeah. That's the proper position. This is it, you can see it there, there's a little blue spot there. It's an inch high. That plant is an inch high. It's alpine and the wind blows, and so it's adapted to that harsh environment up there. Great plant. This is an orchid from, I forget exactly, I think it's African, Angraecum. This is a Angraecum orchid, here's the word, Angraecum orchid. It was sent to Darwin, I'm sure, dried, pressed, dried. The nectary was 9 inches long. Oops, sorry. And I don't know which one of these is a nectary. Looks like this one maybe. Oh no, here's a nectary, this thing. So the nectar's down here. But the insertion point to get at it is up here, and it's 9 inches long. So they sent this to Darwin. He said, well, there has to be a pollinator with a tongue that's 9 inches long. And I think it was after he died that they found this xanthopan moth. And so the proboscis is there. It doesn't show up very well, so I think I outlined it in red. Yeah, it goes from that moth up to that upper flower. So it's a symbiotic relationship, and it's highly predictable. And it's a nice point in the sense that that is this way, I mentioned the word interpretation. You can look at flowers, sometimes you can look at insects and other animals, and you can understand something about how they're going to fit into the larger environment. If you see, like Darwin immediately understood, if this has a nectar 9 inches long, it's got to be a pollinator that's got proboscis 9 inches long. So here's kind of an overall picture of success of these different plant groups over time. So let's see, what we have here, millions of years ago. Here's the present, 0. 400 million years ago, there were no flowering plants, although I'll tell you what, this is a somewhat old chart, and flowering plants now are, it would go more like this. They're more like 300 million years old, I forget. They just, it's a matter of finding fossils, rare fossils of something that looks like a flowering plant that then can be aged. Anyhow, more to the point here, this is sort of abundance, this is genera, 600 genera, 500 genera. It could also say families, which is a little more familiar to us, but in this case it is genera. But the point is, there's only so many ferns on the planet. I think maybe 12,000. I don't know why the conifer, what is this genera? Conifers, there's only 600 conifers on the planet, 600 species, maybe 650. So I don't know why this is as wide as it is, but the point here is that their reproductive strategies, their survival strategies had a certain level of success. Ferns are ancient. They existed long before 400 million years ago. They still exist. There's 12,000 species. But in terms of diversity, flowering plants took over the planet. Not necessarily in terms of landmass. There's still plenty of ferns, plenty of conifers, but flowering plants numbers are high, 300,000 species. So diversity is highly desirable on the planet because of the change, because the physical environment changes. You have to be able to adapt to it, so the more variability is, the more likely some species will survive. We don't think in those terms, but it is true. I had a hard time remembering this, so if we were to condense the history of the Earth into 1 year, then the first plant arose on April 8th. But it must have been aquatic because July 1st is photosynthesis. I think so I put this together about 5 years ago, and I saw a date for photosynthesis that was earlier than that. So we'll just get a general sense here, because this is the first land plants, would have been in December. So all of this history of the Earth, there were no plants on land. I mentioned that 4 billion years, there was no life. You can't have insects. Plants make all the food. So if there's no plants, there's no life. There's no life on land. So it's only in December, only the last 400,000 years, that plants have existed, and flowering plants are just December 31st. So it's a journey. Life is on a journey. It's constantly changing, constantly adapting. We're near the end. Offer you that encouragement. I mentioned this line. I took the word out. What goes up here?
Plant.
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the most important single metabolic innovation in the history of life. We're going to talk about it a little bit. I really like thinking about photosynthesis. I looked into it a little more, and unfortunately, it's extremely complex. It's not a simple metabolic phenomenon, but we can get the basics of it. So this is life on Earth in billions of tons. A gigaton is a billion tons, so plants are by far the dominant life form on the planet. It's all made by photosynthesis. What is photosynthesis? It's all the others. If you're an animal, you have to have something to eat. 2 gigatons of animals on the planet compared to 4. What do animals eat? They eat plants. What do fungi eat? Plants. Protists, bacteria. They can't make food. These things can't make food. All the food is made by plants and certain photosynthetic bacteria, which are not really shown on here. So I like this story. It's easy to understand. I forget exactly where I go with this because I only have that one picture. What else comes up here? Yes. So this is a hydrogen atom. It has 1 proton and 1 electron. You probably even remember that. And sometimes a neutron and sometimes not, strangely enough. I don't know what that's about. But here's the thing. Atoms have electron shells. And hydrogen only has 1 shell. That's it right there. That shell holds 2 electrons. But hydrogen only has 1. So hydrogen is more stable if that second shell is filled. So it's looking for a partner. It's built in to the structure, the atomic structure of the universe, this tendency to join together and complexify over time. So what do I mean by that? The electron shell holds 2 electrons more. Therefore, hydrogen readily combines with oxygen. So oxygen has a second shell. Notice, its first shell is full, 2. The second shell has 6, but it holds 8. It holds 8. It wants 2 more. How many electrons would it have to share with hydrogen to fill the second shell? 2. It's called H2O. It's called water. It was inevitable from the beginning of the universe that water would form because of this atomic structure. It's built into the structure of the universe. It's very trippy. It really is. Carbon. Okay, look how much we've learned. Carbon has, oops, sorry. Don't look at that. Carbon, the inner electron shell is full, holds 2. Second shell holds 8, only has 4. So it wants 4 more. Well, let's see. It could join with oxygen. If oxygen, two electrons, each oxygen wants 2. Remember over here? I'm sorry, I apologize. It wants 2. Each atom wants 2. Well, it could share 2 with carbon twice. And then you'd have CO2, carbon dioxide. It's a natural evolutionary product of the structure of the universe. It's just inevitable that carbon dioxide will form. So this is a quote by a reputable guy. He's a Nobel laureate, a biochemist. There's no shortage of self-assembly in the universe. Things just assemble because of this electronic potential built into the atoms, from snowflakes to the rings of Saturn. So powerful is this impulse to assemble that many scientists now believe life may be inevitable, an obligatory manifestation of matter. It's just such a great line. And I think maybe you see what I mean. It's just built into the structure of the atoms. They want to join together. They want to complexify. It's not just H2O and CO2. It keeps going after that. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about something that has a very precise structure, and yet you can fit 5 trillion hydrogen atoms on the head of a pin. So how is it possible that the universe has this intensely, perfectly defined structure at a scale that is unimaginable to us? And that's why I actually meant to say at the beginning, there's a miraculous quality to the whole program, to life on Earth, to our lives. It's very magical and mysterious. So, what is photosynthesis? Well, you know what photosynthesis is roughly, but photosynthesis is carbon dioxide joining with the hydrogen from water. So what photosynthesis does is it splits water apart. And why is the atmosphere full of oxygen, 21% oxygen? Because photosynthesis split it from water and released it out the holes in the leaves called stomata. It took the hydrogen and combined it with carbon dioxide, and a little magic trick, you end up with sugar. That's the formula for glucose, white sugar, C6H12O6. It's made, that's what photosynthesis makes, is sugar, which is a chemical molecule that stores the energy of the sun in the way that the electrons are configured. And if you can change the configuration of those electrons, move them further from the nucleus of the atom, it gives off energy. So that's why we eat food, because photosynthesis captured the energy of the sun in these chemical bonds. We eat the food. We breathe oxygen. Why do we breathe oxygen? To break up the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate. That's sugar, that's starch, that's oil, that's coal, that's natural gas. They're all carbohydrates. They all have the energy of the sun stored in that bond. That's why Lynn Margulis said it's the greatest single metabolic invention in the history of the planet. It's responsible for all life on the planet. And the sun, it's 93 million miles away. How is it doing this work from 93 million miles away? That's ridiculous. The whole arrangement is preposterous. Plants are 90% carbon dioxide. People do not realize this, and it's quite a story. And so that story is told in this YouTube video that I encourage you to watch, and I think I put the name in, it'll show up down here. It's called Photosynthesis at MIT. Just Google it. Photosynthesis at MIT. It's 5 minutes long. So these guys just graduated from MIT, and they show him announcing, MIT is the premier engineering and chemical university in the world. And then they interview these guys. There's a interview bunch from Harvard, and they handed this guy a seed in his hand, and then they give him this piece of wood. And he says, well, where did the wood come from? And he says, dirt. He says, wrong. It doesn't come from dirt. It comes from carbon dioxide. Most of the biomass on the planet are trees. Trees are 90% carbon dioxide. I'm telling you, it's like a magic show. So what's happening is the biosphere is appearing out of the atmosphere. Literally. It's mostly gas. Life is a gas. You can tell him I said so. So Brian Swim's a very cool guy. You can Google him too. And he likes to say, well, that's impressive. So what's impressive here? The biosphere is appearing out of the atmosphere and it's made out of gas. Well, that's impressive. It is very impressive. And trying to remember which button to push here. So Google photosynthesis at MIT, and you'll see this guy. And he'll say plants are made out of dirt, and they aren't made out of dirt. Photosynthesis, a good mention. So there was no oxygen in the atmosphere on the early Earth because there was no photosynthesis. It all comes from photosynthesis, and that has made animal life possible. All animals breathe oxygen, and what do they use it for? To break up the carbohydrates that were made by photosynthesis and release the energy of the sun. Really, we're a little offspring of the sun. If you think about it, all of our energy comes from the sun. I don't know what I did there. So this is oxygen in the atmosphere over time. That's 1 billion years ago, 500 million years ago. Presently, there's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. Where did it come from? It came from photosynthesis. There is an interesting storyline there, and that is that there was a huge spike in oxygen. It went up to 35%. 250 million years ago. I don't know how that played out. You'd think you could not put fires out if oxygen was 35% in the atmosphere. I mean, what do you do to make a fire? Burn, you blow on it. More oxygen. The oxygen combined with iron in water and created iron oxide, a solid, that precipitated out and created the world's iron deposit. So this rock was created by photosynthesis. It was created by oxygen pumped into the atmosphere by plants that then combined with iron in solution and created a solid iron oxide, which created the world's iron deposits. It also created the ozone layer. We could not live without the ozone layer. There's too much cosmic radiation, infrared or ultraviolet. It would just kill us. But the ozone layer, which is O3, 3 atoms of oxygen hooked together, creates a barrier to ultraviolet light. I wanted to give an honorable mention to leaves because we don't think about them. They didn't used to exist. This is some sort of fossil from 40 million years of plants. The first plants had no leaves. Plants had to evolve over time, and they evolved with great gusto. They all look different. And what do? Well, they're solar panels. That's where the plants are gathering and capturing the solar energy. Actually, that's not supposed to look like that. I blocked out the middle just to make it simpler. Oh, there it is. So you don't have to look at so much, but there are advantages. So leaves had to evolve. There are problems with leaves. You lose all the moisture out of the surface of the leaf. Plants have to retain their moisture, but you need a solar panel to gather that solar energy. So there's a trade-off, and they've done it in different ways. So here's large leaves, small leaves, many stomata. So stomata are the little holes in the leaves. This is a picture of a stomata. It looks like a mouth, and the plant can open and close it. There are 400 stomata on average per square millimeter. Millimeter, you can't even find a millimeter. You know, a millimeter is like 1/16 of an inch. The plants are just peppered with these holes that they can open and close to let in carbon dioxide and then close it up to keep from losing water, because they have to retain their water. So there's just trade-offs. We could look at just one here. If you're a larger leaf, you have more photosynthetic capacity. That's great, but it reduces air movement, reduces access to carbon dioxide, which comes from the atmosphere, and you lose more moisture, which it doesn't say, but you do if you're bigger. So there's advantages, smaller leaves, advantages, disadvantages, the way it goes. in the natural world. So this is a bit of a little twist here I'm throwing in. This is in Afghanistan. So I went to Afghanistan several times as a peacenik. And the real point, the alleged point here is that there are flowers everywhere. So we were driving along, going out of Kabul, going to a village called Istalif, and there were crocuses everywhere. I said, stop the bus, stop the bus. I really did. I made him stop the bus, and I got out and took pictures. It was in a wheat field. They were wild. They were just growing there, crocuses. But the touching thing to me is that all of this beauty exists everywhere in the world. And so we went to Istalif, and that kid was there. And that kid was actually up on a hill in Kabul. But, so this was 2008, I think. The amazing thing to me is I remember those kids like crystal clear. They were so beautiful. I remember them better than those crocuses. And so there's beauty there. You know, the beauty in the human race is the same as the beauty in the flowers. And then I just looked up Istalif. I remembered the name of that village we went to. It was like 30 miles out of Kabul. I looked it up last night online, and it turns out that in the 1300s, it was the favorite city of the Emperor Babur, and it was the land considered to be the land of milk and honey. Well, it was just a dusty little adobe town on a hill when I visited it. But what's interesting is Afghanistan, we don't think of it that way. Afghanistan has this incredibly rich history when it was considered to be the land of milk and honey, and I'll tell you now, it's milked dry at this point. But these things are all temporary. It can be rehabilitated. And I went to Palestine, and I took this picture of cyclamen growing probably on limestone, and it has swept-back petals. You've seen that before in Dodecatheon in Shooting Stars. It's probably buzz-pollinated. And then I went to see some people, and I brought hand lenses. I brought this hand lens, and I gave it to Jana. And I brought this book on the wildflowers of the Middle East, and I gave that to Jana. So this is my effort to create peace. So Jana's an interesting person. She is known as the world's youngest journalist. She's not as young as she used to be. She started when she was 7, documenting what was going on in her village, which is that village right there. She's now about 15, and she's still a journalist. If you did on YouTube the world's youngest journalist, you'll get this 7-year-old girl. Anyhow, it was just nice to go there to these places and think about the flowers and talk to people about the flowers, and they loved it. They loved the hand lenses, they loved the books. They didn't have access to that kind of thing. We're done, except some emerging qualities of plants. Well, we know this. Plants are the primary source of biomass on the planet, of living tissue. Plants make 99% of it. Plants change the chemistry of the atmosphere. We talked about that. Plants are a geologic force. They created the iron deposits all over the planet, and they sequester all that carbon. They made the carbon that then gets sequestered underground as coal, fossils. Plants make terrestrial life possible. 1,000 times more plant life than animal life. Plants are the source of fossil fuels. Our human ancestors spent our formative years in the trees, in plants, swinging around in the plants. And I like this last one. It is thought. There's a great book called Catching Fire, and it's about early Homo, probably, I'm forgetting. What came before Homo sapiens? Neanderthals, they would be back a little further. Yeah, Homo erectus, that's what I'm thinking of, Homo erectus. It's the Homo erectus, which was, so Homo sapiens are said to be 200,000 years old. Homo erectus is probably 2 million years old, fossils. Probably the thing is, some species of the Homo genus started using fire to cook food, which made far more nutrients available to the body. And it's thought that that's what allowed for the very rapid expansion of the human brain. We do have huge brains. They don't work all that well, but we do have huge brains. And it's because of plants. It's because we learned how to control fire, which is burning plants. So we owe our existence to plants. So closing, one of three closing lines, to the Art de Chardin, who was a Catholic priest and an anthropologist. The purpose of this is just poetic, it's not perfectly true. Ever more perfect eyes in a world in which there's always more to see. There is always more to see. Those are pollen grains magnified and probably colorized, artificially colorized. But you magnify pollen grains which are invisible to the eye, and they're just magnificent. And that's the nature of life on the planet. This is a local kid. I just like the picture. But John Muir, all the wild world is beautiful. It doesn't matter where we go. I think of that when I want to take my next, 8,000-mile trip. It's like, why do you have to go 8,000 miles? And John Muir said, all I need to do to get ready for an adventure is throw some bread and tea in an old sack and jump over the back fence.
Amen.
Yeah, it's a great line.
Woo!
Amen and the end.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your endurance.